Madden Blake's expensive shoes splashed into a grimy puddle, and for the first time in years, the CEO of one of the biggest tech conglomerates in New York missed a train literally and figuratively. He stood on the edge of the platform, staring at the red taillights of the Amtrak fading into the distance. His tailored black coat flapped in the cold wind, and his jaw ticked with frustration. His assistant had royally messed up the schedule. His phone had died mid-call, and now, the one train that could have gotten him to Boston on time for the Global Investor Summit was gone. "Damn it," he muttered, running a hand through his dark hair. He looked completely out of place, too polished, too expensive for the chaotic energy of Penn Station. "Missed it?" a voice said beside him. He turned to find a woman balancing 2 coffee cups and a worn leather camera bag slung across her chest. She had curly chestnut hair pulled into a messy bun, and her coat looked like it had seen better winters. But her eyes bright, curious, and completely unbothered by the flurry of commuters locked with his. "Obviously," Madden said, sharper than he meant to. She raised an eyebrow. "Cool. Thought I'd ask before offering you one of these. You look like you could use it." She handed him a coffee. He hesitated. "You don't even know me. You're a guy in a $1,000 coat who looks like he just got dumped by Amtrak." "I'm being nice, not stupid." She grinned, unbothered. He took the cup. "Thanks. And for the record, it's closer to 1,500. She laughed. "Wow, you're not even trying to sound humble about it." "Huh. I'm not in the mood to pretend to be anything I'm not." "Fair enough." She extended her hand. "Calla Jennings." He shook it. "Madden." Her lips twitched. "Like the football game?" He was almost annoyed. Almost. But instead, for reasons he couldn't explain, he smiled. "No. Like the guy who owns Blake Tech." She blinked. "Wait, the Madden Blake? The guy from Forbes? You're that Madden?" "Guilty." She studied him again. "You're shorter than I expected." He snorted. "And you're more honest than I expected." "I get that a lot." She took a sip from her coffee and nodded toward the escalator. "Come on. My next train leaves in 20 minutes. You can crash in the seat next to me." He stared at her. "You're offering me a spot on your train?" "No. I'm offering you company while you figure out how to fix your mess. Or you can stand here in your fancy shoes and sulk. Up to you, CEO." He had no reason to follow her. No logical explanation for why he did. But somehow, he found himself walking beside her through the chaos of the station, dodging tourists and dragging his carry-on behind him. They found 2 seats at Gate 8. She pulled out a pack of peanut butter crackers and offered him one. "Do you always carry snacks like a kindergarten teacher?" he asked. "I'm a freelance photographer. I live on vending machines and caffeine." She paused. "And I don't trust airline pretzels." He chuckled, then glanced at her camera bag. "What do you shoot?" "Weddings. Street photography. Sometimes I get lucky and land a magazine spread." She shrugged. "Nothing exciting to a guy like you." He shook his head. "Actually, it sounds nice. Real." She looked surprised. "What, being CEO isn't real?" Madden leaned back. "It's numbers. Deadlines. People pretending to like you because they want something. It's not this." She tilted her head. "This?" He gestured to the 2 of them sitting there, coffee cups between their knees, strangers sharing a strange moment. "This. You. Honest. No filters." Calla didn't reply at first. She just looked at him, really looked, and something in her expression made his chest tighten, not with stress, but something else, something unfamiliar. "You're not what I expected either, Madden Blake." A voice on the speaker announced her train. She stood, slinging her bag over her shoulder. Well, this was fun. Good luck bribing Amtrak into another train. "Wait." She paused. "Where are you going?" "Albany. My grandmother's birthday." He nodded, then surprised himself by saying, "I could drive you." She raised a brow. "Why?" "I want to keep talking to you." "That's not a good reason to offer someone a ride across the state." "It's the only reason I've had all day that feels right." She stared at him, and for a second he thought she'd say no. But instead she sighed. "Do you have a car?" "I have a Bentley parked upstairs." Her eyes widened. "Of course you do. Come on," he said. "Say yes." She laughed under her breath. Fine. But if you murder me, my camera has GPS. He smiled. Deal. They walked up to the parking garage together, the air cold and their breath visible as clouds. When she saw the sleek black Bentley, she tilted her head. This is ridiculous. He opened the passenger door for her. This is Tuesday. The ride was unexpectedly easy. She played old indie music and he didn't hate it. They argued about movies. She hated superhero films. He tried to convince her they weren't all terrible. She told him he didn't laugh enough. He told her she talked too much. They stopped at a roadside diner hours later and he paid for her grilled cheese and pie without blinking. You realize this is the weirdest day of my life, she said as they got back on the road. Mine, too. By the time they pulled up to her grandmother's house, an old blue cottage surrounded by snow, Calla was quiet. She turned to him. Don't read into this. But I had a good time. Me too. He handed her her bag, but before she stepped out she leaned in and kissed his cheek. That's for not being a total jerk. He caught her hand before she left. Can I see you again? She hesitated. Why? You'll forget me by tomorrow. I haven't forgotten a single thing you said. She bit her lip, considering. Then she reached into her bag and handed him a business card. Call me if you ever miss another train. And just like that, she was gone. Madden sat in his car, staring at the card like it was something fragile. Something important. He didn't know it yet, but missing that train was the best thing that had ever happened to him. The snow had melted into slush by the time Madden Blake returned to Manhattan. The city was still humming, still impatient, but something in him had shifted. The usual rhythm meetings, market updates, espresso-fueled decision-making felt jarring now, like trying to sleep through a fire alarm. He stared at the glossy skyline from the corner office of his penthouse suite at the Blake Tech headquarters, his hand resting on the edge of his desk. The city spread out beneath him, vast and glittering, but it felt strangely hollow. Sir, his assistant said, poking her head in. The board meeting starts in 10. Push it. She blinked. Sir? 15 minutes. Tell them I'm reviewing numbers. She hesitated, then nodded and disappeared. His eyes dropped to the business card lying on the desk. Not framed. Not locked away. Just there, beside his laptop. A plain white rectangle with a name and number. He hadn't called. Not yet. He told himself he was too busy, but the truth was uglier. He didn't know what he wanted to say. The door opened again. This time without warning. You're late, said a woman with jet black hair and a pencil skirt that screamed corporate warfare. Veronica Langley stepped inside, unapologetic as always. The Tokyo numbers are tanking and the CFO is spiraling. Madden didn't look at her. Let him spiral. I'm not in the mood to hold hands today. Veronica crossed her arms. Did something happen in Boston? I never made it there. She raised an eyebrow. You? Miss a summit? You drag a broken leg through customs if it meant landing a deal. I got stuck in New York. So? You own 2 helicopters. He looked at her and for once didn't bother to explain. Veronica was brilliant, relentless, and completely incapable of understanding anything that wasn't transactional. She wasn't the kind of person who would understand why he'd chosen to drive a stranger to Albany instead of attending a summit that could have added millions to his empire. She tilted her head. You're distracted. That's bad for business. I'm allowed to be human once in a while. Not when the company's name is your name. He stood, grabbing his coat. I'll be out the rest of the day. Where are you going? He didn't answer. The elevator doors closed before she could follow. By the time he reached the Lower East Side, the sky was bruising with evening. He found the address printed on the card wedged between a bakery and a locksmith's shop. The photography studio was modest, with a chipped doorframe and a small sign that read, Jennings Photography. He hesitated, then pushed the door open. The space was warm, golden with light and filled with soft music playing from an old speaker in the corner. Framed photographs lined the walls, candid shots of couples laughing, children running through fields, wrinkled hands clasped tightly at wedding altars. She was crouched by a light stand, adjusting the angle of a reflector. He watched her for a moment before saying anything. I didn't think you'd actually call, she said without turning. I didn't. Calla stood and faced him, wiping her hands on her jeans. Then what are you doing here, corporate prince? I was in the neighborhood. She gave him a look. He ran a hand through his hair. I wanted to see you. She studied him, arms crossed. Let me guess. Your assistant booked you for something soul-sucking and you thought, hey, let's go find that weird girl with the camera. I don't do things on a whim. That's tragic. He stepped closer. You kiss men you meet in train stations often? Calla laughed. Only the ones who look like they haven't smiled in years. He found himself grinning before he could stop it. She walked over to the counter and poured herself a cup of tea from a chipped kettle. So, what now? You want a photo shoot? A tour of my very glamorous closet full of paint-stained backdrops. I want dinner. She blinked. You're asking me out? I'm trying to. Calla leaned against the counter. You don't strike me as the type who asks. I'm not. But I'm trying something new. She took a slow sip and studied him over the rim. Dinner, huh? What's the catch? No catch. There's always a catch with men like you. Then come find it. They ended up at a small Italian place tucked onto a quiet street, the kind of place with flickering candles and cracked menus. Madden didn't offer to take her somewhere flashy. He didn't need to impress her. Somehow, that fact unnerved him more than any investor pitch he'd ever made. You always this intense over pasta? She teased, twirling spaghetti on her fork. He leaned back in his chair. Only when the person across from me makes me forget my phone exists. Calla tilted her head. Do you always talk like you're trying to close a deal? He smirked, then caught himself. No, I'm just not used to someone calling me out. That's your problem. Too many people let you get away with nonsense. He laughed. You plan to fix that? I might. Their plates were cleared, and dessert came a single tiramisu they shared without thinking. At one point, their hands touched, and neither pulled away. Afterward, they walked in silence. Snow had started again, light and soft, dusting the sidewalks. I don't do this, Calla said, her voice quieter than before. Do what? Date men who belong to newspapers and stock tickers. I'm not asking you to. Then what are you asking? Madden stopped walking. I don't know yet, but I'm asking for a chance to find out. She looked at him, her breath visible in the cold. You're dangerous. I'm not trying to be. Still. He stepped closer. You scare me too. Calla blinked, surprised. Why? Because you're not impressed. You see right through me. And I don't know what to do with that. She looked at him for a long moment, then said, Good night, Madden, before turning and walking the other way. He watched her go, snow collecting on his shoulders, and for the second time in his life, he let someone walk away without chasing them. But this time he knew it wasn't over. This time he would come back. Madden stood in front of the grimy red brick building that housed Calla's studio and apartment, staring up at the third-story window where a soft yellow light glowed against the dusk. He hadn't planned on being here again so soon, but he hadn't been able to focus on anything else since their dinner. Every meeting, every deal, every perfectly choreographed interaction in his world felt off-kilter now, like trying to read a map in a foreign language. He buzzed the intercom. Who is it? It's me. A pause. Then, do you have a reason? I'm not sure, but I think you'll want to hear it. Another long silence. Then the door buzzed open. The staircase was narrow and smelled faintly of paint thinner, but he took the steps 2 at a time. When she opened the apartment door, her hair was damp and her sleeves were pushed up. She had a pen tucked behind her ear and faint smudges of ink on her fingers. You have 5 minutes, she said, stepping aside. He walked in. The apartment was small but full of life, walls pinned with photographs, piles of books stacked under a windowsill, an old record player humming something melodic in the background. A ceramic bowl sat on the table, half filled with tangerines and film canisters. I'm investing in a non-profit, he said before she could say anything else. She blinked. That's not what I thought you were going to say. I know, but it's the truth. I met with a founder yesterday. They're building creative spaces for underfunded communities. Schools, studios, arts programs. I'm backing them. Her expression softened, but only slightly. Why tell me? Because you made me think about what I've been doing with all of this, he gestured vaguely, and how none of it leaves a mark unless I let it. Calla leaned against the wall, arms crossed. That's noble. But you didn't come here to pitch philanthropy. No, I came because I can't stop thinking about you. And it's messing with everything. Good, she said. You need messing with. He stepped closer. You don't trust me. I don't trust what you represent. Men like you don't just walk into people's lives and stay. You drop in, cause a storm, and then vanish when it no longer suits you. I'm not going anywhere. How do I know that? Because you said so? Her eyebrows lifted. Words are easy. He exhaled slowly. Then give me something harder. She hesitated, then turned and walked toward the table. She picked up a small stack of envelopes and held them out. These are unpaid invoices. Clients who ghosted me or changed their minds after I delivered everything. You want to prove something? Help me get them to pay. He took the envelopes without flinching. Done. Calla narrowed her eyes. I'm serious. This isn't a test. It's just life. The boring, frustrating, inconvenient part. I want all of it. She studied him. Really studied him. Then, without warning, her voice dropped. My dad left when I was 7. I used to wait on the porch every Saturday in case he remembered he promised to visit. He never did. That's the part you'll never get. I don't do hope without proof. Madden didn't flinch. Then let me be the proof. She didn't answer. Instead, she walked to the sink, filled a chipped glass with water, and stared out the window. After a long moment, she said, I have a shoot tomorrow. A couple who met in a hospital waiting room. They want photos that feel like a story, not a catalog. I could use an assistant. I'm not exactly subtle with a camera. You won't be behind the lens. Just help carry the gear, hold reflectors, maybe distract the groom if he starts getting awkward. What time? 8. I'll be there. She turned to him, her expression unreadable. We're something that doesn't scream executive boardroom. I'll do my best. When he showed up the next morning, he was wearing dark jeans, a navy sweater, and sneakers that clearly hadn't been worn since college. Calla didn't comment, but he caught the flicker of surprise in her eyes. The shoot was in a narrow greenhouse outside the city, filled with climbing jasmine and wild bursts of lavender. The air was sweet and humid, and Madden found himself holding light diffusers and adjusting props under Calla's direction like he'd been doing it for years. You're better at this than I thought, she murmured as she adjusted the couple's position. I'm very obedient when properly motivated. You're not charming me into trusting you. I wasn't trying to. The couple laughed across the room. The groom leaned in and whispered something to the bride, who blushed and covered her face. Calla snapped a photo, then lowered the camera. That right there. That's what I do this for. When was the last time someone looked at you like that? She glanced at him. I'm not sure they ever have. He didn't say anything, but the knot that twisted in his chest told him he'd make damn sure someone did. That evening, they packed up her van and she let him drive. On the way back, she fell asleep with her head against the window, the hum of the road lulling her into unconsciousness. He glanced at her, her features soft and unguarded in the fading light, and something inside him shifted again, subtler than before, but deeper. He dropped her off without waking her. Instead, he carried her camera bag to the door, left it inside, and let himself out. The next morning, Calla found a note tucked into the bag, scrawled on the back of one of his business cards. Tomorrow we go after the invoices. Wear boots. He didn't include his name. He didn't need to. The next week, they chased down clients across boroughs. He stood in lobbies, at art galleries, and even once in a laundromat, calmly but firmly explaining breach of contract and small claims court in a tone that left no room for negotiation. By the time Thursday rolled around, she had 5 checks in hand and a new glint of something in her eyes. You're dangerous in a very specific way, she said as they shoved envelopes into her lockbox. You said that before. This time, it's different. You didn't have to do this. I wanted to. That's what scares me. That night, they sat on her fire escape, passing a bottle of cider between them while the city buzzed below. Lights flickered in windows and someone strummed a guitar 3 floors down. Calla pulled her knees to her chest. You ever wonder what your life would have looked like if you weren't rich? Every day. She turned her head. Seriously. I didn't grow up with it. The money came later. I earned it. But sometimes I wonder if I lost something while building it. She was quiet for a long time. Then, you didn't lose it. You just forgot where to look. He reached for her hand, and this time, she didn't pull away. They sat there, fingers laced, the city stretching out around them. And for the first time in a long time, Madden Blake didn't feel like he was falling behind or missing anything. He felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The invitation arrived on a Friday. Heavy cream stock, embossed lettering, and the Blake Tech insignia pressed in gold leaf. Calla stared at it, the weight of it unfamiliar in her hands. Annual Winter Gala, she read aloud, frowning. Black tie, charity auction, Skyline Tower. Madden stood beside her bookshelf, flipping through one of her photography portfolios. It's a fundraiser. Silent bids, cocktail speeches, very little dancing. She closed the envelope. And I'm supposed to do what? Stand next to you in sequins while people pretend to remember my name. I want you there because you're part of my life now, not as a prop. And what exactly do I wear to something like that? My best thrift store sarcasm? He looked at her then, really looked. I already took care of that. You, what? There's a stylist waiting for you at the Eames atelier. She owes me 3 favors. You're her 4th. Let me guess. You left a credit card but no budget. I told her to listen to you. Not price tags. Calla narrowed her eyes. You're walking a very thin line between sweet and manipulative. I'm counting on you to push back if I cross it. She exhaled, fingers tightening around the envelope. Fine. But if anyone asks me what I do, I'm telling them I launder money. She arrived at the atelier the next morning. The space was all glass and mirrors with a showroom so pristine it felt like stepping into a whisper. The stylist, a woman named Yvette in wide-legged trousers and a blunt bob, smiled like she already knew the ending. You're late, Yvette said, not unkindly. I wasn't aware I had an appointment. You have an entrance to make. Let's get started. 3 hours later, Calla left with a garment bag slung over her shoulder and instructions to arrive fashionably 10 minutes late. She didn't ask what Madden would be wearing. She didn't want to imagine him in anything more commanding than he already was. The gala was held at the top of Skyline Tower, the tallest building on the east side. A string quartet played in the glass atrium and waiters floated by with trays of champagne and canapes no bigger than bottle caps. Guests in designer gowns and tailored tuxedos moved through the space like they'd been born rehearsing this. Calla stepped out of the elevator and immediately felt like she'd wandered into someone else's dream. Her dress, midnight blue with a plunging back and a waterfall of soft tulle, was unlike anything she'd ever worn. It moved when she did, silent and fluid, as if it had a mind of its own. Madden found her before she could take a full breath. He was in a black velvet jacket and a crisp white shirt, his presence drawing glances without effort. When he saw her, his expression changed not to awe, not to shock but to something deeper, like recognition. You clean up, she said, voice low. You redefine the word. He offered his arm. She took it. The first hour was a blur of introductions, congratulations, and strategically vague questions about how they met. She answered them all with a polite smile and a version of the truth no one would believe. The man who'd built an empire from code and capital had missed a train. The woman who lived off freelance gigs and instant ramen had offered him a coffee. And somehow they had ended up here. During the auction, Madden disappeared briefly to speak on stage. Calla wandered onto the balcony, grateful for the cold air. She wasn't used to being observed like a rare painting. A voice behind her said, "You're the girl." She turned to see Veronica Langley, flawless in silver and holding a glass of something expensive. I've been called worse, Calla said. Veronica joined her at the edge of the balcony. He changed after he met you. I don't know if that's good or dangerous. I'm not trying to change him. That's the part that changes everything. Calla looked back inside. Madden was standing by the auctioneer, hands tucked into his pockets, listening without interrupting. Controlled, magnetic, yet somehow soft around the edges tonight. I'm not here to compete, Calla said. Veronica laughed. Oh, sweetheart, you already won. Later, when the final bid was called and the guests began to drift toward the elevators, Madden found her again. I bought something, he said. Please tell me it wasn't that sculpture made of forks. He slipped a small envelope into her hand. She unfolded the card. It was a certificate handwritten with a wax seal. Studio space. 1 year. Rent covered. Utilities included. She stared at it. This was in the auction? No. I added it. Her voice caught. Madden. I didn't do it for applause. I did it because your work deserves walls that don't leak when it rains. She blinked, fighting the tightness in her chest. You're going to ruin me for anyone else. Good. They left before midnight, escaping the crowd and slipping into his town car without ceremony. Neither of them spoke until the city lights blurred past the windows and the tension drained from their shoulders. He reached over. "Come with me this weekend." "Where?" "Vermont. I have a cabin. No Wi-Fi. One fireplace. Plenty of silence." She hesitated. "Why now?" "Because I want to know what it's like to be with you when no one's watching." They left the next morning. The road twisted through frostbitten hills and pine forests heavy with snow. The cabin was all dark wood and wide windows perched on the edge of a frozen lake. Inside, it smelled like cedar and old books. They cooked together badly. She burned the pancakes. He undercooked the eggs. They ended up eating toast and laughing like it was gourmet. At night, they lay side by side on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the fire throw shadows against the ceiling. She turned to him after a long stretch of silence. "What happens when this slows down? It doesn't have to, but it will." "Life does." He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Then we build something solid enough to survive it." "I want that," she whispered. "But I'm scared." He kissed her, slow and certain. "So am I. That's how I know it matters." They stayed for 3 days. When they returned, the world hadn't changed. But they had. Weeks passed. Her studio opened. Clients booked months in advance. Her photos hung in a small gallery uptown. Madden showed up wearing jeans and no security detail. On a Thursday afternoon, as the light slanted just right through her windows, he handed her a small box. "No occasion," he said. Inside was a key. She stared at it. "To what?" He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded deed. A new studio. Her name on the paperwork. Closer to the galleries. Rent-free. A gift but not charity. She closed the box slowly. "You really missed that train, didn't you?" He nodded. "Best mistake I ever made." Spring came. The city thawed. Her grandmother came down from Albany and insisted on meeting the man who made my Calla stop rolling her eyes at love. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the skyline, Madden took her hand and pulled her onto the rooftop of her building. He'd strung up lights, placed candles in mason jars, and laid out a record player spinning a Nina Simone album. She laughed. "This is absurd." He knelt without a word. No velvet box. No speech rehearsed 100 times. Just him holding a ring that looked like it belonged in a book of poems. "I don't want perfect," he said. "I want real. I want you." Her hands were shaking. "I'm not the kind of girl who dreamed about a wedding." "Then we'll build something better." She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Yes," she said. He stood and kissed her. The city glowed behind them, loud and unbothered. Somewhere below, life kept rushing forward. But here, on a rooftop strung with cheap lights and wild hope, two people stood still, finally together, finally home. The sky over Santorini was the color of blush wine as the sun dipped low behind the cliffs, casting golden light across the whitewashed village. Madden stood barefoot on the terrace of their villa, the Aegean Sea stretching endlessly behind him. The breeze lifted the edge of his linen shirt and he watched Calla through the open doors. She was inside, barefoot and sun-kissed, tapping away at her laptop with a look of fierce concentration. "I thought the point of this vacation was to unplug," he said, resting a hand on the doorframe. "I'm not plugged in," she replied without looking up. "I'm editing." "There's a difference." "You said that yesterday." She grinned and kept typing. "And the day before." He crossed the room and gently closed the laptop. "You've documented every inch of this island. I think it can survive without you for one more night." "I'm not documenting it for the island. I'm documenting it for us." He kissed her temple. "I don't need a gallery to remember this." She leaned into him. "I know. But I do." Outside, the villa's private infinity pool shimmered under the fading light. Madden poured 2 glasses of chilled white wine, handed her one, and they stepped out onto the terrace. Below them, the village lights flickered on like stars, soft, warm, slow. "I never thought I'd say this," Calla murmured, "but I actually like the quiet. You hated silence when we met." "I didn't hate it. I just didn't trust it." He took her hand. "And now?" She looked out over the sea. "Now I know it doesn't mean something bad is coming. It just means I'm not fighting anymore." He lifted her hand to his lips. "You're not alone anymore either." They spent the evening wrapped in a blanket, watching the horizon dissolve into dusk. The only sounds the rustle of wind and the distant hum of a fishing boat returning to harbor. The next morning, Madden woke early. He slipped out of bed without waking her, careful not to disturb the way her hair was tangled across the pillow. He made a call, gave 3 quiet instructions, and slipped back under the covers before her eyes fluttered open. "What time is it?" she mumbled. "Still early. Go back to sleep." But she didn't. She curled into his chest and traced shapes along his ribs. "I had a dream that we lived in a cottage," she said. "It had ivy and a yellow door." "Where?" "I don't know. Somewhere that didn't feel rushed." He kissed the top of her head. "We can have that. I've never stayed in one place longer than a year. Then let's break the streak." Later that day, they boarded a private boat Madden had arranged. It wasn't flashy, just sleek, classic, and quiet. Calla looked suspicious as soon as she saw it. "Are we going somewhere, or is this another one of your metaphorical gestures? Can it be both?" They sailed along the coast until they reached a secluded cove where a small chapel clung to the rocks like it had been waiting for something. Or someone. "Madden," she said slowly, "why does that building look suspiciously like a wedding chapel?" "Because it is." She turned to him, brows lifted. "You're not proposing here, are you?" "No. I'm showing you a place I found." "Just in case." "In case what?" "In case you say yes." He reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out something small, something wrapped in velvet but worn at the edges. He opened it to reveal a ring unlike anything mass-produced, a vintage setting with a rose-cut diamond, flanked by 2 tiny sapphires like twin constellations. "This belonged to my mother," he said. "She wore it until the day she died. Said it reminded her that love didn't need to be loud to last." Calla blinked, her breath catching. "I don't need a ballroom or 1,000 guests. I don't need a press release or a photographer. I just need you. If you want to wait, I'll wait. But if you want to do this now quietly, simply, with just the sea and sky and your crooked smile, then I'm ready." She stared at him, stunned into silence. Then she stepped forward and took his face in both hands. "You already know the answer." He slid the ring onto her finger, and she threw her arms around him, laughter caught in her throat as he spun her once, the sea wind rising around them. They were married that afternoon. No gown, no crowd, no vows rehearsed. Just 2 people standing barefoot in a centuries-old chapel, the priest speaking Greek and the wind catching her curls as she whispered, "I do." They returned to the villa as husband and wife, Calla still barefoot, her dress clinging to her legs from the sea spray. That night, they made dinner together, grilled fish, olives, warm bread, and danced in the kitchen to a record she'd brought from home. Their marriage wasn't a performance. It was a breath. A steady, wild, beautiful breath. Back in New York, things changed, but only the things that needed to. Madden stepped back from the day-to-day grind of Blake Tech, handing more responsibility to people who had earned it. He focused on the nonprofit initiative he'd backed, turning it into a full foundation that built creative spaces in underserved communities. Calla took on fewer clients but bigger projects, photo essays that explored forgotten corners of the city and stories that had never made the headlines. They moved into a brownstone in Brooklyn, one with ivy crawling up the side and, at her insistence, a yellow door. The 3rd floor became her new studio, flooded with light and filled with work that made people feel something. The basement became his bookshelves, a record collection, a desk no one was allowed to clean but him. Every Sunday they made pancakes. She still burned them half the time. They didn't try to impress each other. They didn't pretend to be perfect. They just showed up every day, every time, in all the ways that mattered. And when their daughter was born a year later, wide-eyed and loud and already defiant, Madden cried so hard he forgot to cut the cord. Calla held her close and whispered, "She's going to be wild." And Madden said, "She'll be safe." They named her Elia, after the olive trees that lined the coast of the island where everything had changed. One night, years later, Calla walked out onto the rooftop of their brownstone to find Madden staring up at the stars. She curled into his side, her head on his shoulder. "Do you ever miss the noise?" she asked. "Sometimes. But then I hear you breathe, and I remember what quiet can be." She smiled against his skin. "We did it backwards, you know?" "I know. And it was perfect." He kissed her temple, the night folding around them like a secret. They didn't need to chase anything anymore. They'd already found it.